In this section, we're going to cover consideration. As a review, our contract elements are mutual assent, consideration, capacity, and legality. And in this section, we will talk about consideration. So consideration is the bargain for exchange in a contract. Each party has to give something and each party gets something. So it's called a bargain for exchange. It could be a promise in exchange for a promise in exchange for an act, or a promise made for forbearance of an act, so not doing something I'm legally allowed to do. The adequacy of the consideration is generally irrelevant. A court is not usually going to focus on the value, so they're not going to say that I made a bad deal, I'm free to make a bad deal, I'm free to pay too much or accept too little for the thing or the service or whatever the contract is about. The only exception is for unconscionable consideration, and that means unconscionable means it shocks the conscience. So that usually happens when one party has much greater bargaining power than the other. And the consideration has to be legal, so both the benefits and the sacrifices must be legal. A party has to be able to provide that or not provide that or sell that. Types of consideration are money, property and services, promises not to sue, so a release. These are usually negotiated prior to filing a suit. Or a charitable pledge is allowed to be consideration, even though often it's not technically consideration on both sides. So I agree to give money to a charity. Generally, I have not received any consideration, but courts enforce those under 3 principles. First, if there is actual consideration given, if my pledge is commemorated in some way. So if I make a large donation to a college, for example, I might get naming rights on the building. So they might name the building after me, and that would be consideration. Or they might give me a plaque or something else like that. Also, we can have promissory estoppel, and that's when the courts will enforce a pledge to a charity because of detrimental reliance. So if I pledge to give the charity $100,000 and they enter into a contract to purchase a building and then I back out, they have detrimentally relied on my promise. And finally, public policy. We say it would violate public policy to let one pledgor out of an obligation. This is used when there's many pledges, but they're for undetermined uses. Here, Jack backed into Alan's car, damaging it. John is liable to pay for the damages, but does not have the money right now. While Alan could sue John for the damages to his car, he enters into an agreement with John to give him 90 days to pay the full amount of $1,500, plus an additional $250 for the inconvenience. The agreement states that Alan will not file a lawsuit before the 90 days is up, but is free to do so after that time. This agreement, or contract, provides consideration for both parties because John's benefit is that Alan gives up the right to sue for 90 days, and Alan's benefit is that John will pay for the damages plus an additional $250. Brittany agrees to sell her car to Bill for $1,000. Bill's payment is consideration for Brittany's promise to sell him the car, and Brittany's consideration is her promise to sell him the car. Notice Brittany's consideration is not her car. That will be the end of the transaction. Brittany's consideration is her promise. A landlord and a prospective tenant meet to discuss the rental of a condo. At the meeting, they go over the terms of the lease and agree to enter into the lease, which is signed by both the landlord and the tenant. In this type of contract, the landlord agrees to provide the tenant with housing, that's the consideration, and then the tenant promises to pay rent in return, that's their consideration. Some problems with consideration we might run into. First is a term we call accord and satisfaction. So if we are unsatisfied with the work or the amount of consideration in the contract, accord and satisfaction is when we accept an amount that is less than the amount due as full payment. This creates a new agreement between the parties and the contract has been satisfied. The accord is the mutual agreement to the new terms, and the satisfaction is the performance of the accord. All right, so if I cash a check marked payment in full and that check is for less than our agreed upon amount, that's often accord and satisfaction. And courts will say that I accepted a lesser amount as payment in full on the contract. Usually words aren't enough. Somebody can't just hand me a check and say, this is payment in full, I'm not paying you another dollar if it's less than what the contract is owed. It usually has to be in writing. Here we have to have, for accord satisfaction to be a valid satisfaction of the contract, we have to have a genuine dispute over the contract, a suggested settlement, and then an acceptance of that settlement. Sometimes we enforce contracts without consideration. You could do that when a promise is under seal. All right, and that is a promise that's generally executed in a very formal manner, and they're historically enforced absent consideration, but generally not today. If I make a promise after a discharge in bankruptcy, so I have filed bankruptcy and all my debts have been forgiven, but I reaffirm the debt. I say I will pay you even though it was discharged. That's generally enforceable. Promise to pay debts barred by a statute of limitations are generally enforceable. A statute of limitations is how long after an action can I bring suit. So if I have owed this money and it's a debt and I've owed it for 3 years and the statute of limitations is 4 years, there's 1 more year to bring a suit. If I owe a debt and it was 4 years ago that I owed the debt and I didn't pay it, and the statute of limitations is 3 years, the statute of limitations is run. But if at year 4 I promise to pay that debt, even though it's barred by the statute of limitations, that will be enforced, even though there's no new consideration. And then promises enforced by promissory estoppel will be enforced. And that's when the party making the promise knew or should have known that the other party might make a definite change in position based on the promise. So this is all based on justice and fairness, and it will be enforced. And then options. Options are when we keep an offer open for a certain period of time, and usually to have an option we have to pay for that option, so there's consideration on both sides. But in the case of a merchant does not have to receive money to keep an offer open for a certain period of time. That's called a firm offer. And in the case of a merchant, again, there has to be no consideration paid to the merchant to receive a firm offer, but they cannot exceed 3 months. Some other problems with consideration are unenforceable agreements. All right, the first is a pre-existing duty. So if I can't promise to do something that I'm already obligated to do and have it be an enforceable contract. The second is past consideration. If I promise to give someone something for goods or services provided in the past, that is past consideration. That's not a valid contract. There are illusory promises. These are too indefinite to be enforceable. And then finally, there's future gifts and legacies. This usually involves someone's will. So someone might say, I like you so much, I'm going to leave you my house in my will. Well, they might do that, but that's not an enforceable contract because there's no consideration. So here are some examples of the pre-existing duty rule. Wendy owns a hamburger shop located on Main Street. Dave is a police officer whose daily beat includes Main Street. Dave promises Wendy that he will keep an eye on Wendy's store if Wendy promises to pay him $100 a month. Wendy agrees. In this circumstance, Wendy's promise is unenforceable because watching Wendy's store is within the scope of Dave's official duties to begin with. It is his job to monitor his particular beat. Wendy's store is in that, so this is a pre-existing duty. If Wendy's store was outside his normal beat, then this could be a contract, but it's not. Mike hires an architect to build a house. Mike agrees to pay the architect $1 million, and the architect agrees to build the house according to the specifications that Mike lays out. Mike and the architect then agree to a modification of the contract, under which the architect promises to build the house according to the same specifications that Mike originally laid out, and promises to pay $1.5 million. In this case, the architect has promised to render the same performance that Mike has agreed to pay more than the amount he originally agreed to pay. Under the legal duty rule or the pre-existing duty rule, the architect's new promise is not consideration for Mike's promise to pay more money, and therefore the architect cannot enforce this modification against Mike. So the architect already had this duty to do this work, right? They have a scope of work and they've agreed on it, and he agreed to provide this work for $1 million. And now they've entered into a new agreement where the scope of work has not changed, but now he gets $1.5 million. This is the pre-existing duty rule. This will not be enforced. There are some exceptions to this rule when conditions have materially changed. So if I'm a builder and prices have skyrocketed because of a shortage of lumber, for example, a court might enforce a renegotiation of a contract in that case. But here, There's no indication that any terms have materially changed, so the architect was already under a duty to provide this service. So this additional $500,000, there's no consideration for that. An example of past consideration is here. Imagine, for instance, that you're taking a walk and see another person fall and hurt themselves. You rush to help the injured person, taking them back to your house and helping them heal. To show their appreciation, the other person promises to pay you $1,000. The aid that you have given the injured person would be considered past consideration. So this is not an enforceable agreement. This usually arises out of moral obligations. So this person helped you and you want to reward them by paying them $1,000. You can do that, but it's not an enforceable contract. This is past consideration. Although you were not legally required to help them, you felt morally obligated, and your fulfillment of this moral duty resulted in you being paid. And finally, illusory promises. Here, Choco Time Candy Company enters into a contract with cocoa merchants in which Choco Time will purchase all the cocoa it needs for its candy from cocoa merchants, and cocoa merchants will sell as much cocoa as it wants to Choco Time. Because this contract binds Choco Time to purchasing all the cocoa it needs only from cocoa merchants, Choco Time is not bound to do anything. In fact, cocoa merchants could choose not to sell any cocoa to Choco Time if it desired. This is one type of illusory promise, and it makes the contract invalid and unenforceable. So this is too indefinite to be enforceable because the court can't even decide what should have happened, right? Because Choco Time doesn't actually have to buy any cocoa. It's obligated to do nothing.